It is my privilege to speak to you on a very, very important subject, a subject that I have entitled Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles. And I have subtitled it, The Communist Use of Music. And we would appreciate it if we could settle down, please. And if we could keep our decor as ladies and gentlemen until we're through with the meeting. I might say this, we have rented the hall. This is our meeting. If you don't agree with what you've heard here tonight, you can rent this hall tomorrow night and bring your own crowd. And we expect you at least to act the part, even if you don't feel the part, because this is the only way we can run our meeting. We don't believe in anarchy, and we will be respective and respectable. Now tonight, in the next 45 minutes, we're going to traverse a subject that most of you have never dreamt about. We're going to look at a subject that most of us know at least something about, because most of us are familiar with music. To begin with, let's go back to the USSR, to three individuals. And those of you who are taking notes, we trust that you'll jot these three men down. The first one is Dr. Ivan P. Pavlov. Dr. Pavlov was a very famous Russian physiologist. At the request of Nikolai Lenin, the atheistic communist who overthrew the Kerensky regime, contrary to what some of your history books would have you believe, by the way. Ivan Pavlov came to Moscow as a personal house guest of Nikolai Lenin. Upon hearing what Pavlov was doing, Lenin said to him, "Would you stay in my house as my guest and write down everything you've told me?" Pavlov did. It took him about 3 months. He penned a 400-page manuscript. Upon reading the manuscript, Nikolai Lenin turned to Pavlov and said, "You have saved the Russian Revolution." Now, this man is a very important individual. There is a book called Lectures on Conditioned Reflex by Pavlov that we'll notice in a few minutes, but it isn't apropos at this particular point. The second individual that we'd like to have you jot down is Dr. A.R. Luria. Dr. Luria was a Pavlovian scientist who worked along with Pavlov. I have his book with me, by the way, tonight, for those of you who would like to give it a cursory glance. It's in paperback, too. Dr. Luria is a Russian scientist who is the head of communistic education in Moscow. He was in this country on a tour in 1960. He has penned this book that I will tell you about in a few moments. Let me just, however, state this before I do. From 1924 to 1929, A.R. Luria experimented with children and found that he could make them mentally sick through a combination of certain types of music and hypnotism. Now, I know many of you will think, well, hypnotism, that seems rather strange. We're way out in cloud 9. Now, by hypnotism, I don't mean pulling rabbits out of a hat. This is something extremely serious and very real. Quickly, I would turn you to one quote by Edward Hunter in his book Brainwashing, which, by the way, is in paperback right now. And on page 213, Hunter says, "An ideology so ruthlessly materialistic as communism would be at variance with its own philosophy if it failed to make use of drugs and hypnotism." Let me just briefly run down what Dr. A.R. Luria did with children, beginning as young as 2.5 years of age. 1, he put them under severe nervous tension. 2, he created in them artificial degrees of neurosis. 3, he interfered with their normal maturation of the nervous system, of the cortical portion of the brain. 4, he destroyed their normal inhibitory mechanisms of the cerebral cortex. And 5, he induced them into hypnosis. He found, and by the way, you will find complete chapters on what I've just stated in this book that he penned in 1932. And the name of the book is The Nature of Human Conflict. And it's subtitled An Objective Study of the Disorganization and Control of Human Behavior. You will find charts in here on the reactions of these children as they were nerve jammed by Luria. The third individual that we want to pay our respects to, another Russian communist and a scientist, is K.I. Platonov. That's spelled like Plato and then N-O-V at the end. Platonov has written a book entitled The Word as a Physiological and Therapeutic Factor. On the front cover, you will notice something extremely important. It is published by the Foreign Languages Publishing House of Moscow. So even you liberals have to admit at least a hint that this might have a red streak down its back. The communists in Moscow aren't known to publish any conservative publications. In this work, Platonov goes into great detail in the area of hypnosis, and on page 425 and following, he mentions the fact that there are 3 depths to hypnotism, and that the first stage is a waking state in which the child can be induced to receive hypnotic suggestion. He doesn't even have to be put into a sleep. Although we're going to see that they also have a means of placing children into sleep and also into receiving hypnotic suggestion while in this particular sleep. So these are the 3 individuals that we could spend 2 hours on this easily. In fact, to go through this whole lecture takes, well, as much time as I perhaps could have. But because I only have 45 minutes tonight, I have to go over this rather rapidly. I might say that this will all be in printed form in the next few weeks through Christian Crusade with all the documentation. And for you young people who like to study, there are over 150 footnotes to put your teeth into and do some homework. But with all of the groundwork finished, with all of the foundational stones laid in the laboratory, the psychopoliticians in Russia decided that this was the time to strike and to use what these scientists had found in their laboratories to render a generation of American young people mentally ill and make them incapable of defending their homeland. So already we're in the area of brainwashing, and that's why many of you tonight will not believe a word I'm saying. Because according to Edward Hunter, when you're in this area, you're so far below the normal mind that it's impossible to grasp that some people would even think of such dastardly things. You see, most people believe other people believe like they believe, or most people think other people think like they think, when in reality there are some people who think otherwise. And in this area, these characters are so far below our normal grasp that it's hard for us to believe that some would even dare to tamper with the minds of our children and make them mentally ill. But as we're going to see, they have a master music plan to render a generation of American youth mentally sick. So let's begin, and let's bring over the manuscripts, and let's bring over the program to the United States of America. And I have to admit that it's very difficult to believe. I've pinched myself many, many nights. I've asked my wife over and over again, do you think it's really true? But my only conclusion is that it is, in fact, true. In 1946, a man by the name of Norman Corwin went to Moscow with 2 records produced by the American Soviet Music Society. These records were played to a cultural group in Moscow. He then came back into the United States of America and procured a number of educators and entertainers and set up a number of communist recording companies. Now, these recording companies were set up with the sole purpose of making the young people who listened to these records mentally sick. Now, we're going to name these record companies for you tonight, and when you go home, you can throw out some of these records. I'll guarantee you before I begin that many of you will have some of these records in your home tonight. You will also find these records in your school systems. And when we're through tonight, you can go back to your kindergartens and make sure that the teacher isn't playing these records. The teachers do not know these records are subversive and communistic. Number one of the key record companies that these communists set up in 1946 to disc records to make our youth mentally sick is known as Young People's Records Incorporated. Now, I have some of these records with me. You'll see on the top there it'll say Young People's Records Incorporated. I have some of these jackets that you can look at after the meeting if you have a skeptical eye, or if you're from Missouri, or worse. But anyway, Young People's Records is the key. Young People's Records forms the parent organization. Now let me stop there and show you just a few things. This organization has been cited by at least 9 different government documents as subversive or communistic, or at least in the context of being endorsed fully by the Communist Party. I don't have time to go through all of these. I'll just mention I have this one with me that you can look at. It's entitled 100 Things You Should Know About Communism and Education. Now, many of you in this area can purchase this. If you can't purchase it through your government printing office, we have some additional copies at Christian Crusade in Tulsa. On page 16 it says, here are a few which have been declared subversive by the Attorney General, the Committee on Un-American Activities, or some other official investigating agency. And on page 17 at the top, and I have it underlined, Young People's Records. You will also find it in this volume of your own state, the 4th report of the Un-American Activities in the state of California for 1948 on page 392. You will also find it mentioned in the testimony of Dr. Bella Dodd. And you will also find the president of Young People's Records giving his testimony before the House Committee on Un-American Activities and taking the 5th and the 1st for 4 straight pages. Now, people, this is not innuendo. Now, I know your newspaper here is going to go out and say this blabbermouth noble said by innuendo that Young People's Records is a subversive and a communistic organization. This is what even the liberals have to admit is hard intelligence. You see, the liberals have 2 kinds of intelligence today, hard and soft. This is hard intelligence. This isn't hearsay. It's all in your own official government documentations. What else can I do? Stand on my head and whistle Dixie? Now, this parent organization has spawned 2 offspring that are very important to jot down. Number 1, Pram Records, P-R-A-M, Pram. These records are for babies. At the back it says, listen to this, Pram records are for babies. Their subjects, concepts, and language are directed specifically to the 1- and 2-year-olds. This is just part of their master music plan. They have a plan from the cradle through the university student, as we're going to see tonight. Now on the back of this, you'll see in the bottom, Pram Records, a product of Young People's Records Incorporated. Now the second subsidiary is perhaps the most important for many of you people, because these will be the records that you have in your homes tonight. Children's Record Guild records. These records are in hundreds of thousands of American homes tonight in all 50 states in Canada, and they're in school systems in every state of the Union plus Canada. And we're going to show you how they got them there to begin with. Now this is the CRG, the Children's Record Guild. On the back it will say, a Young People's Record Production. Now those are three that we've mentioned so far. Now there's a fourth one, and I'm just going to throw this in here for the sake of some of you university students. They also have a record company for you, and the name of it is People's Songs Incorporated. Now this communist organization was also set up in 1946. It was set up by a number of identified Reds. Identified Reds. This is not, again, innuendo. This is hard intelligence. Two of the most famous founders of this organization are people that you are familiar with. Number one, Peter Seeger. And number two, Woody Guthrie. Amen. Now, that's all right. Just let's listen here. If you will take the Committee on Un-American Activities report for the annual report of the year 1961, I have all of this with me, and again, this is hard intelligence. You will find here on page 43 and on page 44 the reference to Peter Seeger as identified with the Communist Party. You will also find it in the annual report for 1960 of the House Committee's report, and here it says, quote on page 51, Pete Seeger, another identified communist. Now listen, people, this is very serious. The same men that will clap for Peter Seeger tonight are the same men who will not salute the American flag. I have with me the investigation of the Un-American Activities Committee, Volume 14 on Woody Guthrie. Now listen to this. Hard intelligence. Quote, now Woody Guthrie, comma, a communist, comma, is a guitar-playing, ballet-singing entertainer brought to New York by Will Greer, also a communist, and incidentally the grandson-in-law of Ella May Bloor, known as Mother Bloor, Pennsylvania State Secretary of the Communist Party. But now listen to this. Listen to this. Down here it says this. Woody Guthrie, quote, was the columnist for the Daily Worker. Now you've had a little trouble on some of your campuses throughout the state, particularly Berkeley. By the way, we'll be up there in a few days. We expect to have a good time up there too. We have a good time wherever we go. People's Song Incorporated was established in 1946 by the Communist Party to reach our young people through folk music. It has changed its name since 46. It is now known as People's Artists Incorporated. Its editor is an identified communist by the name of Irwin Silber, and its official publication is Sing Out. Now, if you want to see how close to home these things touch once in a while, I'll get back to the campus riots in a minute. Here's a book that you can pick up on your newsstand right tonight called Hootenanny Tonight. On the first page in the foreword it says, Peter Seeger and Woody Guthrie. On the second page it says, sing out. And then you know what it says? If you enjoy the folk music in this little book, please write to Sing Out and have them put you on their mailing list. Now look, people, most of the songs in here are innocuous. I have to admit that. Most of them are innocuous, but the bait is already swallowed if they can induce our young people to write to Sing Out. Now, not all of the songs in here are innocuous. There are some loaded ones. For example, on page 122, there's what they call the suicide song. Listen to this. Oh, come with me to the kitchen, to the kitchen, to the kitchen. Oh, come with me to the kitchen. And there a date with death we both will keep. Turn on the gas in the oven, in the oven, in the oven. Turn on the gas in the oven, and it will gently lull us both to sleep. Now look. Oh, don't get excited. We've just begun. When you beat that music to these young people, and these guitar playing start to strum, you all feel like going to the kitchen. Now, your distinguished governor, at least distinct, has stated the fact that there is no communism involved at the University of campus, at the University of Berkeley, at the University of California, Berkeley. Oh, he stated this. I read it over in the Tulsa paper even. Now here's the front page of the Chicago Tribune. They nabbed 800 over there. It reads like this: the rebels did this, the rebels did that. The rebels did this, the rebels did that. When you got through with it, you were wondering if this were Berkeley, California, or the Congo. And then it mentions the simple fact that the student riots were led by Muriel Savio and his little girlfriend, Bettina Aptheker. Now, guess who Bettina is? Our friend Bettina is the daughter of Herbert Aptheker, who for many, many years was the editor of Political Affairs, the theoretical magazine of the Communist Party. By the way, he took a leave of absence. Do you know what he's doing right now? You won't believe this. He's spending full time, well, he's also lecturing on college campuses. You know, this is academic freedom. We can't get on these campuses. They call it academic prostitution. But I mean, these men can get on because of this. But anyway, besides lecturing to your young people on your campus, he is spending practically full time finishing up his history books on U.S. history that are to be used when they take over the United States of America. That's your friend and mine, Herbert. His daughter is Muriel's girlfriend. They're on a semi-honeymoon right now, going from college campus to college campus, trying to have some more fun with some more riots. But let me say this. She is also the leader in the W.E.B. Du Bois Club at that university, which J. Edgar Hoover has identified as a communist front organization. But of course, everyone knew this. If you knew W.E.B. Du Bois, he joined the Communist Party 2 years before he died. Now look, it mentions some of those that were caught at the riot. The first person to be arrested was a non-student, it says, by the name of Robert Truehalt, Oakland attorney. Now who's Robert? Well, listen, all you have to do is pick up an index by some of our, either by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee or by the House Committee on American Activities, to find out who Robert is. Robert Truehalt was identified as a member of the Communist Party in sworn testimony by at least 3 individuals. Now, either your governor has a poor research department in your state, or he didn't call to find out what the score was over there at Berkeley. But then listen to this. Joan Baez, guitar-playing folk singer, sang the civil rights, "We Shall Overcome." Amen. Now look, according to Newsweek, our friend Joan says that her hero is none other than Peter Seeger. And by the way, you will find Peter Seeger and Joan Baez on the platforms of many, many bowls and rallies and concerts and, well, you name it, and they're there usually together. Now, I can't say that Joan Baez is a member of the Communist Party. I have no proof that this is true. But I do have proof with the other ones, and that's as far as I can go, because I do not try, at least, to say anything unless I can document and prove whatever I'm saying. Now look, here we have the scheme. We have these 4 record companies, or at least these 2 major ones, Young People's Records and People Songs Incorporated, established in 1946. Now let's go back and pick up the thread. Pram records are for babies. Children's Record Guild records take off where the Pram leaves off. And then from there we graduate to Young People's Records. There's only one loophole: our high school student. Do you think they've left the high school student behind? Or can you think of a type of music that makes and causes our young people to riot and destroy? Now, even to ask the question is to answer it, but we have a few things to mention before we approach the subject. Now, tonight we're going to hear a record. The record that you are about to hear is a record produced by the Children's Record Guild record. This record is to be played in your kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. I'm not going to prejudge the record. I want you to listen to it very, very carefully. Listen to the music and to the words. And when we're through with the record, we will then turn to some expert testimony by medical doctors in the field of hypnosis and analyze this record. The name of the record is The Little Puppet.
Say, how would you look if I turned you into a puppet? First I tie the strings to your head, then strings to your hands and legs, then abracadabra, hippily-boo, soft gum, you're all wooden. Here's a puppet boy, he's all wood from head to toe, and here's a puppet girl, she's as wooden as the boy. Here's a puppet boy, he's all wood from head to toe, and here's a puppet girl, she's as wooden as the boy. Now I'm going to pull all the strings and make you move. Little puppet, walk with your legs and arms so stiff. Oh, little puppet, walk like the funny wooden doll. Little puppet, walk with your legs and arms so stiff. Oh, little puppet, walk like the funny wooden doll. Turn your head, first to one side, then the other. Turn your head, like the funny wooden doll. Turn your head, first to one side, then the other. Turn your head, like the funny wooden doll.
Now notice this wind sound in here. Here it'll come again. That is to grate the nervous system of the youngster. Here it'll come again.
And down you drop them, lift your arms up high like a silly wooden doll. Drop
Now, the name of that record was The Little Puppet, and most of you people have to admit, if I brought that record to your home one night and played it, before your family and said, no, this is a subversive and a communistic record, you'd throw me out on my ear. And there's a reason for it. And this reason is incorporated in this record. Now, I can't say that the communists thought up this. Dr. Leon Freedom, in the book by Edward Hunter on page 238, says that really in this area the Reds haven't thought up anything new. All they have done is take what free science has developed and use it in a manner that would ordinarily be considered mad. And then he also says this, and their objective is solely to make minds sick. But let's just look what they have used and incorporated in this record. The communists, or at least the free world, and I think, and I'm going to quote Dr. Bryan Jr. here, and he quotes a Britisher, so I'm sure this was known before this, but the Reds at least have used this technique. They found that when they beat, now listen to this carefully, when they beat music at the pulse rate of the particular age group that they are trying to induce into receiving hypnotic suggestion or Marxist suggestion, that particular age group would receive those suggestions with a greater deal of force than under normal circumstances. Now let me show you why this is important to know for you folk singing enthusiasts. Dr. Bryan Jr. says this, quote, sometimes a well-known folk song's tempo will be changed to the same beat as the normal pulse beat, which makes it more effective for induction. And he's talking about induction into hypnosis. These communist folk singers on our college campuses are beating their folk music. I have nothing against folk music per se, just when the communists use it for their own end. They're beating the folk song and the folk music at the pulse rate of our university and college students. And when they sing their Marxist ditties, these college students are picking up these ditties with a greater deal of force than under normal circumstances. A very scientific procedure, by the way. Now look, most of you adults here tonight, you older people at least, have a pulse rate someplace in the 60s. This is general, this is average. You students here in the 70s. But this record was beat for kindergarten students, and their pulse rate happens to be in the 80s. And this record was beat at approximately 82 beats per minute. Now let's see what some of the doctors have said in their analyzation of some of these communist records. The first I will quote is Dr. Granville F. Knight from Santa Monica, California. Quote, there is no question in my mind about the hypnotic effects of the so-called sleepy songs which are usually found on each record. Now this was not a sleepy time record. They use different techniques. They even have a record that'll give a child physical illness. It's called Tom's Hiccups. But this sleepy time record, let me just show you what this does in a hurry. I wish we had time to play all these records. In fact, next Wednesday I will be playing and giving this material to the board of the LA County Medical Association. There's a possibility that we'll be able to give it to all the doctors in the LA area at their monthly meeting. I think it's every Tuesday, first Tuesday of every month. But anyway, in the sleepy song record, the teacher is to put the needle on the record to induce the child to sleep during the sleepy time period in kindergarten, first, second, third grade. Guess what? This record places the student into a sleep, but it isn't a normal sleep. It's what we call a hypnotic sleep. And as that record continues to move and to emit suggestions, they are picked up by the subcortical portion of the brain of that child called the thalamus. And when he wakes up, He has a compulsion to do the things that he's heard on that record. But here's the catch, and it's all in Luria's book. Those suggestions that he has picked up are suggestions that he's incapable of fulfilling. And when he has a compulsion to do those things and finds out he can't do those things, it's just one of the process to break him and to nerve jam him within. Very scientific. In fact, let me say this, these records are so scientific that the Reds haven't had to re-disc the Masters in 15 years. They're doing exactly what they were set out to do. And they're still doing them. And they're more in evidence today than ever before, as we're going to point out. But anyway, let's look what he says here. He says, hypnotic induction by means of these records could easily place young children in a most receptive mood for suggestions of various sorts. These might include suggestions about world citizenship against patriotism and against nationalism. Now I know if you're a liberal tonight, you have to only conclude that Dr. Knight is a nut. But let me just at least rub the edge off of this conclusion with this hard intelligence that I have with me. The United Nations has seen fit to endorse 2 record companies in the United States of America. Guess which 2? Young People's Records and Children's Record Guild Records. And for this I would turn you to the Los Angeles Evening Herald Express for October 23, 1961. And even at this early date, the writer mentions the fact that it seems strange these 2 they pick out have both been declared subversive by our government, and in fact, he says, developed in Russia, financed in America. So maybe Granville Knight isn't such a nut after all. Dr. J.A. Boucher is my second authority, and he's one of Canada's leading authorities, by the way, in the field of hypnosis. And he says this, I have played these at length and found that they are certainly something to give plenty of thought and consideration to, and I would agree that they are in the hypnosis category. Now, my final authority is one of America's leading authorities in the field of hypnosis, right here in L.A., or right here, or near here. Everything seems to be one vast city when I travel those freeways. In L.A., there is a man by the name of Dr. William J. Bryan, Jr. He is the founder of the American Journal of Hypnosis on Sunset Boulevard. He is the editor of the American Journal of Hypnosis. He has given a 6-page legal-sized transcription of his analyses of some of these records. Now listen to what he says about the one you've just heard tonight, the little puppet. Quote, in the first place, the thing that strikes me immediately is that the tempo is the same as the pulse rate, approximately 82 beats a minute. And Hans Studemeister in the British Medical Journal of Hypnotism commented on a research program of this very thing. And then he goes on and explains what I've just explained to you. When you beat music at the pulse rate of the particular age group you're trying to induce them to receive in either hypnotic suggestion or other kinds of suggestion, they will receive those suggestions with a greater deal of impact than under normal circumstances. Page 2, he says, I would be happy to take 10 children and with a few words play this record for them and show you that you can induce every one of them into a state of hypnosis. And then he says this, and I'm sure this is exactly what's been going on in the nurseries around here. Now the most important quote that I have in this area is on page 4, and listen very carefully. Dr. Bryan is quoting Dr. Van Salstedt, who gave a speech at the 4th International Psychiatric Congress held in Barcelona, Spain. And here's what he says. One of the tremendous increases in mental illnesses in this country today is by virtue of the fact that there is a tremendous increase in the accidental hypnosis that is going on. This is no accident. This is a planned, psychopolitical, scientific procedure to make our young people mentally sick. Notice how Dr. Bryan concludes. What are these records doing? Listen to what he says. They're breeding a tremendous race of people who are going to be mentally ill. He says it's terrible, it's horrible, it's fantastic. I'll say it is. Now, the question that we must answer tonight, if we possibly can, is how did these records get in your homes and in your school systems? And it's really, to ask the question is to give a very simple answer. You know, I guess conservatives have been more or less labeled as being very simple people with very simple answers to complex questions. Well, tonight, I have a simple answer. I don't know if you'll accept it, but I think I know why these records are all over the country. Now, the record companies were set up in 1946, but they never got off the ground for 6 years. But in 1952, these communist records were endorsed by the Book of the Month Club. That's one reason why they're in hundreds of thousands of American homes tonight, including many of yours. Now, if you want that, it's in the Book of the Month Club News for January 1952. Not only do they recommend Children's Record Guild, but they have a brochure out on them. Number 2, you school teachers, listen to this. Your own official magazine called Grade Teacher has recommended these communist records. Grade Teacher for February 1962 on page 122 recommends young people's records. 3, there's a little newspaper on the East Coast called the New York Times. They have endorsed these communist records. In fact, on the jacket labels of many of these records, it'll say, Best in Children's Records, New York Times. Now, of course, they are the best in children's records. You understand that. If you want your young people mentally ill. And then you have a little pink sheet up here on the coast called the San Francisco Chronicle. By the way, I just talked to them tonight. They have endorsed these communist records. Wait till they hear this. I didn't tell them about that. It takes 3 lines in this report right here to give their endorsement of these red records. This Week magazine has endorsed these communist records. Music Teachers Quarterly has endorsed these communist records. Now look, this is a 33 1/3 album. At the top it says Young People's Records, Children's Record Guild, approved by boards of education and in daily use in thousands of schools in all 50 states and Canada. Look here, ladies. These red records have been endorsed or have been guaranteed by Good Housekeeping. And they have been recommended by Parent Magazine. Now look, it's rather obvious that Gus Hall did not come to your home one night, and go, I'm Gus, General Secretary of the Communist Party, and I have a few records to sell you tonight. That isn't how Gus operates. Gus spends his time on your college campuses with his big grin, peddling his criminal conspiracy called communism, but it's all, of course, in milk toast with a large sugar-coated pill. The poison is in the inside. The students don't see the poison until it's too late. He lets other ones carry on for him. But look, even with all of this recommendation, these records would still not be in our school systems apart from these 2 right here, and others like them, but I have 2 with me. This, for example, is a catalog of phonograph records for 1963. In the introductory remark it says, most of the listings are the products of RCA Victor, Columbia, and Encyclopedia Britannica. Not a hint to the teacher that there are communist records in here. But interspersed throughout this whole catalog are these communist records. And do you know how you can spot them, people? RCA Victor and Columbia records sell for $15, $11.50, $7.50, $6.98, $5.98, $4.98, $3.98, $2.98. Do you know how much these red records sell for? $1.24 retail, 90 cents wholesale. Look here. This is an elementary school catalog for you school teachers. Lions, the name that merits your confidence, it says at the bottom. Look here. On page 55, they don't even beat around the bush. Children's Record Guild. And on page 57, Young People's Records. In fact, they're even selling the little puppet, the one you heard here tonight. I wish I had time to analyze the words of this record. Even the words are very scientifically placed in this record, and they're all analyzed by Dr. Bryan Jr. But here it says, the little puppet, child imagines he's a puppet. It's exactly what he's supposed to do. He is to have implanted in his subconscious that he can't do a stupid thing unless the puppeteer pulls the strings. And when she lets loose, he falls and says, "Did you fall, little puppet?" And the word fall to a kindergarten student is a very traumatic word. All of it beautifully, scientifically placed into this record. And this isn't the only one either, believe me. Now, this is all the time I have allotted on this type of music. The type of music that we've just discussed is called rhythmic music. It is an activity music. Lift your arms, drop them, lift them, drop them, touch the ground, go deeper and deeper, lower, still lower. If you know anything about hypnosis, you understand that this is exactly what the whole thing is about. If the student drops his arms like this, he is on his way into a state of hypnosis. If he doesn't, the teacher can spot it, or the psychopolitician can spot it. But the point is, in the classrooms, these records don't need a psychopolitician in the classroom. The teacher can be completely innocent of all these things, and most of them are. We had one teacher in Texas come up with a stack of them like that, and she was crying like a baby, and she said, "I've been playing these records for 15 years to my young people, and never knew what I was doing to them." We were over in Boise, Idaho, and after the meeting, the lady came up and she said, "I want you to come downtown with me." We went down to her shop. She has the largest record shop in Boise. And her husband was already there ferreting out all these communist records from among their stacks of records, and she had a whole stack of them when we were finished. And you know what she told me? The teachers in this area are buying these records by the hundreds. She says, now I have to go back and round them all up. Of course, she was patriotic enough to do that. A lot of business people aren't like that, sad to say. Now, what can we do here? One, we can go home and clean out our own record bin. Two, we can go to our school systems, make sure the teachers there are aware that these record companies are communistic and subversive. Three, we have now found that they're using these records on television programs for kiddies programs in the morning. Call your television and ask the lady in charge of the young people's program what record she's using. We've also found these records in churches. People, they're all over the country. They've been in this area for 18 years. We're just catching on now to what it's all about. Okay, I wish I had more time on that, but I don't, because I have to pay my respects to my fine feathered friends, the Beatles. Now, my major premise, which is very important to understand, is simply this. By the way, don't feel badly tonight. We were over in Salem, Oregon, and the paper there blew this thing sky high, and the next day in class, one of the teachers read what we were saying, or what the reporter purported that we were saying, and she said to a group of students, well, why don't you go to the meeting in Albany the next night and break that meeting wide open? So that night, 25 young people came, and they sat right down in the front. And you know what they did all night? They were very courteous. And 2.5 hours later, they came up, and they said, you know, Mr. Noble, we came here to break up your meeting tonight. But after we heard what you had to say, we're going back to tell the teacher that you're not a nut.
Now, if I only can at least make some young people think, I feel I have accomplished what I have set out to do. I've already stated one of my premises, that is that the communists have a master music plan to make our young people mentally ill. They have Pram records, Children's Record Guild, Young People's Records. These records are good for young people up to about 11. After that, rhythmic music does not have the effect that beat music has upon youth. And then we've already noticed that they have used folk music for the university student because rhythmic music does not affect university students. So they have these communist front organizations, PRAM, Children's Record Guild, and Young People's Records up to 11. And then for the university student, they have People's Songs Incorporated, or as I've already mentioned, People's Artists Incorporated. Now what do they have for our high school students? What music can you think of makes our high school students riot and destroy? And to even ask the question is practically to answer the question if you read the newspapers. 5,000 students here in such and such a locale had a riot. The police were called out to dispel the hysterical fans. 14,000 students in this area had a riot. Police were called out to quelch the contagious hysteria. Name it, on and on and on. Now look, I have the Chicago Sun-Times for September the 5th. It says here at the top, Beatles play here today to 13,000. In the body of the article it says, in Vancouver, British Columbia, 100 persons were stomped, gouged, elbowed, and otherwise collapsed within 29 minutes of their performance. It says in Melbourne, Australia, according to the Saturday Evening Post for August the 8th, that when the Beatles left, they left behind them 1,000 casualties. August the 8th, Saturday Evening Post. That's hard intelligence. They were in Beirut, Lebanon, and they brought out the fire hoses to disperse the hysterical fans. And let me say this, as long as we're in that area of the world, the only nation that has prohibited the Beatles from entering upon their seashore or their country is the nation of Israel. The Minister of Education says they do not want their youth to experience mass hysteria. And this is rather ironical, too, people, because the manager of the Beatles is a Jew, Brian Epstein. So I guess Brian hasn't called home base lately to find out what gives. Now, the Beatles were in Dallas, Texas. And there in Dallas, we're told, according to this news clipping, that the girls talked in low tones because they were in the grip of Beatle fever. By the way, the Beatles attract about 85% female, and I think I know the reason for this too, but I can't get into it tonight. But anyway, listen to this. The girls talk in low tones. Invite me to your high school, I'll talk about it there. Now, what do girls do in the grip of Beatle fever? Listen to this, quote, the word was that they bite their lips until they bleed, they get overexcited, and they take off their clothes. Now, that's normal, of course, if you're a beatnik. I've seen beatniks at the University of Wisconsin do their hokey-pokey dances on the streets, and they were practically doing the striptease with the guitar. But people, this isn't normal. But what our teenagers are experiencing in Beatle Concert Hall, in Animal Concert Hall, in Sinners Concert Hall, these are all groups of rock and roll people, by the way, in Mindbenders Concert Hall, is very, very scientific. There's a new group out now called the Mindbenders. That's quite an accolade, and I think it's perhaps quite well put. To understand what your teenagers are experiencing in Beatle Concert Hall, we have to go back to Ivan P. Pavlov and the laboratories of the USSR. Now, for this, I would direct you to Lectures on Conditioned Reflex, Chapter 36 of the 1928 edition. And it is entitled Artificial Neurosis. Now, I have a news clipping from your paper here. It says, "Hard day's night ahead for Noble." And then it says down here at the bottom, "Being compared to Pavlov's dogs reduced Sharon to sputtering rage." Well, Sharon, let's look at the dogs. But let me preface it by saying this. The experiment that I'm about to relate has also been tried on human beings, and it works. Ivan Pavlov came into his laboratory one day, and he fed his dog. As he fed the dog began to secrete saliva. At the same time, he rang a metronome 60 beats a minute. The next day he walked into the laboratory, he fed the dog began to secrete saliva, and he rang the metronome 60 beats a minute. The next day he did the same thing, and the next day he did the same thing, and the next day he did the same thing, and one day he walked into the laboratory, and he didn't feed the dog. He just rang the metronome 60 beats a minute. And guess what the dog did? Began to secrete saliva. His salivary glands secreted saliva because in the mind of the animal, the bell had taken the place of the food. This is known as a conditioned reflex, and the technical term is the excitatory reflex. Remember that word, excitatory reflex. The bell was able to excite the animal to secrete saliva with no food present. Now the next day he walks into the laboratory and he rings another metronome 120 beats a minute. But this time he doesn't feed the dog. 120 and no food, 120 and no food, and 120 and no food, until one day he finds that that dog will never secrete saliva as long as he rings the metronome at 120 beats a minute. So now the dog has two conditions, one the excitatory and the latter the inhibitory. One day this nut walks into the laboratory and he rings both metronomes at the same time. This one was beating 60 and it told the dog to secrete saliva. This one here was beating 120 and told him never to secrete saliva. Guess what the dog did? His whole nervous system was visibly shaken. And then at a given moment, Pavlov switches the metronomes. And the one that was beating 60 beats 120. The one that was beating 120 beats 60. And at the moment he crosses the inhibitory and the excitatory reflex in that dog, the dog breaks down with a case known as artificial neurosis. He then tried it on prisoners of war and found that human beings can be broken the same identical way. Ladies and gentlemen, I am contending that rock and roll is doing this very thing to our teenagers. And before you go any further, let me show you exactly how it's done. Now let me preface this by saying this first. Rock and roll in music theory is one of the most destructive types of music available today. In music theory. And let me tell you why, young people. With the right hand, the drummer will beat a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and at the same time, the left hand is beating a 1 and 2 and 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3, 4. And then when you begin to speed these up and speed them up and speed them up, it's like placing two horses in that young people and having them go in two different directions. This is in music theory itself. And if you don't believe it, when I gave this speech up at Boise, Idaho, I had in my audience a professor of music at the Chicago Conservatory of Music. And he told me after the meeting that when he was in England, he was talking to Sir Cyril Scott, Britain's leading composer, and he mentioned the fact that when this music first came out, Sir Cyril Scott remarked that this was from the pit of hell itself. So even in music theory, there's something wrong with it. But listen, let's forget about the theory right now. Let's go to the practice. 14,000 teenagers crowd Beatle concert hall. Okay? Now look, these teenage girls come in with a built-in inhibitory reflex placed there by you parents. They have been told before they ever entered that hall not to riot, not to take off their clothes in public, not to roll down the aisles with their dresses up to you know where, not to stand in their chairs and wreak destruction in that auditorium. These have already been given to these youngsters. They're already inbred in them. Within 29 minutes, they're doing those very things. And do you know why? I'll tell you why. Again, it's a very scientific procedure. The music, and it's primarily the beat of the drum. Through the beat of the drum, they are able to excite the excitatory reflex to a point where it crosses the built-in inhibitory reflex, and our young people are breaking down with cases known as artificial neurosis. Now notice, Dr. William R. Sargent, and who taught, by the way, at Harvard University for many years, but he was from England, mentions the fact in his book, Battle for the Mind, that when you cross in a human being these two reflexes, you cause that person to suffer disorganized behavior. These teenagers would never do those things under normal circumstances, but people, this is not normal. I'm contending that the Beatles are causing our young people to suffer three things. Number one, they are completely demoralizing them. Now I have with me this TV Master Guide, which was written by a pro-Beatle fan. He says, I developed a healthy respect for the Beatles. So I'm not taking it from someone who's anti-Beatle. In fact, all of my material I've tried to glean from the other side. Now listen to what he says. Now Bernie McMurdy was at Seattle when the Beatles were there. Listen to what he says. Witness the utter trash of the program the promoters had the nerve to put on with the Beatles. It was not only trash, it was lewd, disgusting, revolting, and an insult to the money charged. A trio of colored women with a male companion indulged in such twisting and organistic jerks as to put an old-time belly carnival dancer to shame. He says, that entire evening seemed designed to arouse every animal and sex instinct in the audience to an uncontrollable pitch, and it did just that. I could go into great detail here. I could go into juvenile delinquency. Every juvenile delinquent has one common denominator. He is emotionally disturbed. And a great deal of our emotionally disturbed young people are emotionally disturbed because of the music they listen to. But that is a field that I can't get into tonight. But number one, I am contending that they are demoralizing our youth. And if this were all they were doing, it would be enough to stop it. Or at least enough to alert them. Secondly, I'm contending that they are causing our young people to suffer cases of artificial neurosis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, many of these young girls will walk out into the cold air and they will snap out of it just like that. But many of them don't. And listen to this sad news. According to the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, and no one can contend that this is a right-wing, extreme department of our government, according to this department, the highest rate of mental illness in the country today is among our teenagers. And who would have ever expected it? Happy-go-lucky people, why are they breaking down? One reason could be the music they're listening to. And then lastly, and perhaps most seriously, I am contending, and I want you to hear me through on this because this is very serious, I am contending that the Beatles are preparing our teenagers for riot and ultimately revolution. And for this, I would turn you to the Saturday Evening Post for August the 8th, and no one here can contend that I am again using an extreme right-wing publication. According to the Saturday Evening Post for August the 8th, we read on page 25, quote, to British intellectuals, now listen to this very carefully, to British intellectuals, the Beatles are carrying the banner of the British Beat generation, and their success represents a breakthrough for the social rebellion the Beatles represent. Now, pray tell, what could this be? There's a hint what it might be on page 28. Listen to this. It's incredible, absolutely incredible, says Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer. Now listen, I'm not saying this. The press officer of the Beatles is saying it. Let's listen to their own press officer. Here are these 4 boys from Liverpool. Now, according to the paper the other week, the Beatles are the heroes to 30 million American teenagers. Now, what does it take to be a hero? Now, look. It's incredible, absolutely incredible, says Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer. Here are these 4 boys from Liverpool. They're rude, they're profane, they're vulgar, and they've taken over the world. It's as if they founded a new religion. They're completely anti-Christ. I mean, he says, I'm anti-Christ as well, but they're so anti-Christ they shock me, which isn't an easy thing to do. That's their press officer. That isn't me. Saturday Evening Post. Now, people, really, when you look at the whole situation, it all makes sense. The same ones that'll die for the Beatles are the same ones who won't die for the United States of America. Now, Dr. Hargis was in England in September, and he mentions the fact that he walked down the streets of London and he noticed all these beatniks every place. He said you got behind them, you couldn't tell if they were male or female. He said even the boys in England were allowing their hair to grow long and curling it and putting ribbons and combs in it. And he said they had a cute little walk down the street. You didn't know if they should call them he, she's, or it's. And then he says this, listen to this. The beatnik crowd, represented by the Beatles, this is England, is the communist crowd. He says in London, if you want to find the Beatles reading, just go by the communist bookstores. They're all over the city. And there you'll find them congregating. And you know what they're talking about? Insurrection, revolution. And let me say this, I can't say this about your universities because I don't know your universities yet, but I can speak for the University of Wisconsin. And the beatniks there were also the communists. I went to school with them. And I can't understand why the American people don't realize this. They talked about it openly. They would sell all of the communist books openly, including Mao Zedong and Che Guevara on guerrilla warfare. Doesn't that seem strange? Now look, let's say that you don't believe a word I've said. Let me conclude tonight, and by the way, we're just beginning, but you have to admit that this is more important than I Love Lucy, and I Love Lucy's over with already, people, okay? Our country is worth more than I Love Lucy and Have Gun Will Smoke, and if we can't stay a few minutes, we might as well quit. Now, I have here the Seattle Times newspaper for August 22, 1964. The Seattle Times, did I say Seattle News? Seattle Times for August 22, 64. On the front page, and you can purchase this, by the way, by writing to the Seattle Times, Seattle, Washington, and send them 25 cents for a copy of their newspaper for that day. On the front page of this newspaper, you will find an article by Dr. Bernard Sabel, who at the request of the Seattle Times went to Beatle Concert Hall in Seattle to listen and to observe. I want to read you his report. He is the child guidance expert for the state of Washington. Listen to his report. Quote, I only can read some of it, but listen anyway. The experience of being with 14,000 teenagers to see the Beatles is unbelievable and frightening. And believe me, it's not at all funny as I at first thought when I accepted the assignment. The hysteria and loss of control go far beyond the impact of the music, and many of those present became frantic, hostile, uncontrolled, screaming, unrecognizable human beings. If this is possible, and it is, he says, parents and adults, not teenagers. You see, our teenagers don't really understand what this whole thing is about. You parents are the ones that are the key here. He says parents and adults have a lot to account for to allow this to go on. Now, the next paragraph is very important. Quote, this is not simply a release, as I at first thought it would be, but a very destructive process. Now, this is important for you older people because you're going to go out of here and you're going to say, well, we had our kick in the 20s, and we had our kick in the 30s, and we had our kick in the 40s. Well, this is their kick in the 60s. People, this is not just a kick. He says it's a very destructive process. And notice why. The externals are terrifying. Normally recognizable girls behaved as if possessed by some demonic urge. Now, that's a medical doctor. That's not a preacher speaking either. Now, look, the next two are also important. The music is loud, primitive, insistent, and strongly rhythmic. Now, in the written material that we have coming out on this, I put a footnote at every one of those words. And then in the footnote, I elaborate and show you what this will do and what it means. But anyway, the music is loud, primitive, insistent, and strongly rhythmic. Then notice the next paragraph. Mix this up with the phenomena of mass hypnosis, contagious hysteria, and the blissful feeling of being mixed up in an all-embracing, organistic experience, and every kid becomes Lord of the Flies or Lord of the Beatles. He concludes, regardless of the causes or reasons for the behavior of these youngsters, it had the impact of an unholy bedlam, the like of which I have never seen. It caused me to feel that such should not be allowed again, if only for the good of the youngsters. It was an orgy for teenagers. Now, people, we are dealing with something that is extremely important. 400 years. Now, listen to this. Before Christ, Plato, in his Republic, and those of you who have his works, jot it down, 424c, mentions the fact that there are certain kinds of music that can be used to overthrow political institutions. 400 years before Christ. And Aristotle knew this too. If you have his works on politics, take a look at 1339a and 1340a and b. Pythagoras knew this. The Egyptians knew this 2,500 years before Christ. Let me say someone else also knew this. Adolf Hitler also knew about this. People, I don't know what to do about the Beatles. I do know what to do about rhythmic records. We can do something about this. We have teenagers right tonight who are so addicted to the Beatles or rock and roll in general, that they can't even study unless they have it blaring in both their ears. And let me warn you, young people, if this is true with you, you will never, never, never be a student who will think in depth. Even if you get good grades right now, the reason is you have a good memory. You will never be a student who will think in depth. Now, some of your young people are so addicted that they're going to have to even consult with Christian psychiatrists. To pull them off of rock and roll will be like taking them off of heroin. It's a sad, sad fact. But you know what? It becomes part of our very bloodstream. Now notice what we have done tonight. We have sketched for you a portrait of what I believe is the communist use of music from the babies through the university students. Is it effective? It's so effective that there's a possibility that we might lose our nation through a song. And do you know what Peter Seeger said? Peter Seeger said, the guitar is mightier than the bomb. Ladies and gentlemen, the communists have many things in their arsenal for the conquest of the United States of America. They have the Homburg hat. Those are the perverts in our State Department and elsewhere. They have the spiked heel. This is Ellen Romish and Bobby Baker and Company, where they take photographs of your senators and congressmen and my senators and congressmen and other high-influential leaders, even including newspaper men, and blackmail them with the photograph. They have unilateral disarmament that they're working at right now. Right now, tonight, the United States of America is 6 times stronger than the USSR. According to these dreamers, they're going to disarm us so that we're both even keel, and then we can live together just like hunky-dory, just like the bear and the lamb. The only fact is that when the bear and the lamb lie down together, the lamb is always inside the bear, and that's exactly what's going to happen to us if we disarm. And then they also have the United Nations. You see, if we surrender to the UN, we're going to surrender to the secretary of the particular department that Major Roberts was referring to tonight, which has always been occupied by a communist. Only once by a Yugoslavian, all the other times by a member of the USSR. But we also have music to concern ourselves with. And ladies and gentlemen, God pray that we never lose our nation through a song. God bless you. Thank you very much.